Chapter 10, XANA's Rebirth. The director's office was a small room that stank of dust and was taken over by a large, dark wooden desk and a metal filing cabinet. Mago's men had placed two powerful computers on the table, capable of connecting to the command post and accessing the code on Richard's Palm computer. Jeremy looked all around him. On the other side of the door were two soldiers standing guard, but he and Memory were alone in the room. After all, she was Mago's assistant, which surely gave her a certain amount of independence. Without making himself noticed, the young boy inspected the content of the first drawer of the desk. He found a stapler and a pen from which he removed the plastic cap and, while Memory had her back to him, used to remove the screws as quickly as possible from the metal tower of the computer. As soon as he finished the operation, a wide smile appeared on his face. Mago's technicians had been ordered to prevent Jeremy from connecting to the internet, but instead of removing the wireless card, they'd simply disconnected the cables. The boy put the wires back in place in several seconds and closed the central processing unit once more. He could succeed. If the factory had a Wi-Fi connection to the internet, he could now localize it, hack the passcode and finally enter in contact with Katic. Jeremy was about to get to work with the keyboard when Memory interrupted him with a hand gesture. The woman took a small artifact out from her pocket that resembled a tennis ball. She held it with two fingers, and from the center of the ball appeared a red antenna. Mago surely set up microphones in this room, but my little machine will interfere with them long enough for us to talk in peace, she said. Faced with a perplexed Jeremy, she continued to speak. Last night, you called me by a new name, Anthea. That's not a new name, the boy murmured. It's your real name. I know. And do you also know my husband? And my daughter? Your daughter is named Aelita, said Jeremy, looking her intensely in the eyes. And your husband is Waldo Schaefer. In other words, Professor Hopper. Memory brought her hands to her mouth. Hopper? The same Hopper who invented the supercomputer? Jeremy saw the woman's eyes fill with tears. He smiled, approached her and began to tell her everything. Lyoko was a fake world. The air hadn't the faintest of scents, and there wasn't even the slightest of a breeze. The snow didn't crunch under the sole of Aelita's elven shoes and ice was everywhere, even though it wasn't cold. The sky was a uniform navy blue. Aelita knew that for the rest of the kids, this strange world was difficult to bear. It made them nauseous and gave them vertigo, and they had trouble adapting to its ambience. But it was different for her. In a sense, she was like XANA, a creature of Lyoko. The tower was glowing in front of them. It was about 10 meters high, and its surface was opaque and smooth like alabaster. Aelita ran as fast as she could with XANA by her side. Can we do it? She asked without slowing down. Will we really be able to open a breach from this Lyoko to the real one from the present? XANA burst out laughing. You'll see, he said to her. Together, we're capable of anything. They quickly crossed the final stretch and stopped one step from the tower. Gnarled roots like tentacles sprung from the ground, twisting and winding around the base of the structure that glowed of its own light. Aelita extended a hand and saw her fingers disappear through the curved wall, creating small ripples on its surface. She crossed through the entrance of the tower like a ghost. She found herself in a dark space illuminated only by the fluorescent symbol that was on the ground, formed by circles and lines that represented the Eye of XANA. From outside, the tower seemed as high as a 5-story building, but its inside seemed infinite. Even upon sharpening her view as much as she could, Aelita wasn't able to make out a ceiling. The young girl knew that in reality there was no ceiling. She looked at XANA, took him by the hand, and walked with him to the center of the eye on the floor. A strong wind pushed them up, ruffling their clothes and flying the children up at a breakneck speed. They suddenly stopped on a small circular platform that was floating in midair. At more or less 1.5 meters above the platform, suspended in the air, was a bright screen. Be brave, whispered XANA. Aelita nodded. With the box from the mirror held strongly in one hand, she pressed her other hand on the screen and suddenly letters appeared on the monitor forming the word Aelita. The walls of the tower became covered with symbols, strange white glyphs that began to glide downward in a cascade of light. XANA posed his hands beside the young girl's, completely covering the screen. He closed his eyes and exclaimed, "Start the procedure." Memory attentively listened to absolutely all of Jeremy's words, then stood and left the room. The boy had let her leave. It must be hard on her. Anthea had been kept prisoner by Hannibal Mago for 20 years. A whole life. And now, she had to learn from the mouth of an unknown boy that her husband was dead, and that her daughter was still alive, but was 13 years old instead of 23. Jeremy sighed. He had avoided telling Anthea certain details, for example, that Aelita was currently on Lyoko with the rest of the kids. He understood how the woman felt, and knowing that her daughter was so close to her might make her feel better, but the young boy had a lot of work to do and needed as much help as possible from both her and Aelita. He let his fingers fly across the keyboard. He tried a direct attack, using brute force, against the passcode of the factory network, then another. A bit later, he managed to strike down all the protection barriers and immediately conceal his invasion by erasing the registries and some other small tricks. Lastly, he took advantage of the internet connection to analyze the state of the transmissions entering and leaving Katic. The science lab had clearly become the center of intelligence, harboring an intense amount of communication. At the moment, through Professor Hertz's computer, about a dozen international telephone conversations were passing. The one making all these calls couldn't be Professor Hertz. Jeremy had only just seen her a while ago in the factory, taken captive. So then who was it? The boy focused in on the active computer and opened a chat window. "I am Jeremy, at the factory on the island," he wrote. "Who am I talking to?" After several moments, a response arrived, "Dido. Is the connection secure?" Jeremy couldn't believe his luck. The boss of the men in black had come to France and was at Katic. "I don't know," he typed. "Okay. It is now. I've activated some devices. Are you able to talk?" Jeremy explained the situation to the woman and read her summary of all the latest events, mouth open. The men in black were ready to attack the factory, and were trying everything they could to get them all out before having to resort to more extreme measures to stop Mago. Dido didn't tell him the type of attack that she had in mind, but Jeremy was smart enough to figure it out on his own. National security was at risk, and the agents would act in response using whichever means necessary at their disposal. What was at risk was too important for them to leave the situation unresolved. The young boy stopped to think, biting his lips. There must be another solution, there must be. "We aren't done yet," he wrote in conclusion. "I'll try to get back in touch with you later." And he closed the window. The screen in front of Aelita had grown. It was now more or less her height, and as wide as a door. It resembled a mirror that would be placed on the inside of a closet door. Except that the young girl was unable to see her reflection in front of her. Instead, she could see a bunch of trees. It was the forest sector of Lyoko. Ulrich and Eva were sitting on the ground, talking. "Aelita," cried Ulrich upon noticing the presence of his friend. The young man hopped to his feet. "Wait." XANA kept him back as he began to approach the screen. "I still need to stabilize the connection." Beside Ulrich appeared another XANA. He was exactly identical to the one with Aelita in the tower, and he had the same focused expression on his face. The two XANAs observed each other for a moment from the two sides of the opening, then the one located with Ulrich brought up his hands to support the lower corners of the screen. It seemed to take a great effort on his part, as if the breach was trying to close itself by exerting an incredible amount of pressure. "What's happening?" asked Aelita with a reedy voice. The XANA by her side gave a tired smile. "The other part of me is helping me to open the connection now with the real Lyoko." This way, we'll be able to take care of Yumi and Odd. The young man raised his hands towards the sky and used them to summon a new screen. Aelita placed her two hands against it to introduce her activation code, and an image formed immediately inside. It was Avad, who had been waiting impatiently on the third underground floor of the factory. Aelita outstretched a hand towards her friend, and her hands sunk into the smooth surface of the screen, crossing through. "Quick," she called out to him. "Come through here." Odd gave an expression of pure and simple stupor. He quickly obeyed, crossing through the screen in a jump, suddenly finding himself beside Aelita and XANA in the tower. The young man with black hair closed the portal with a sigh and made another one appear, this time showing Yumi at the command post of the factory. They had nearly succeeded. The young girl passed through the portal and joined back up with Odd and Aelita inside the tower. XANA closed the breach and approached his copy, who was maintaining the opening to Lyoko. The two XANAs stood face to face, legs apart, anchored firmly to the ground, their arms stretched up against the top of the opening. Their faces were tense from all the effort. Aelita could see their muscles shaking under the pressure, which must have been immense. Yumi jumped through the portal to reach Ulrich and Eva. The young girl clothed as a geisha rushed to embrace the samurai with such love that the two ended up tumbling onto the grass of the forest sector, intertwined. Odd smiled at Eva before leaping with joy in her direction. Aelita exhaled the two XANAs at the same time, their teeth clenched. "Go. Now. I can't hold the breach open for much longer." The young girl hesitated. "What about you?" she asked. "I'll do what I have to do," replied the two XANAs. "But hurry. That's an order." His tone was so forceful and weak that Aelita obeyed instantly. Odd and Ulrich took her by the arms, and the young girl crossed through the screen. She abandoned the mirror and found herself on Lyoko, close to her friends. The portal immediately shut behind her with the ferocious snap of a guillotine. The whirlwind from the implosion tossed XANA's particles with it, or rather, the ones of the XANA who had been stuck within the mirror. The artificial intelligence's passage wasn't physical. A blast of bits of information crossed the software of the portal and entered Lyoko, where the unification procedure that had been awaiting them immediately executed. The experiences and thoughts that had occupied the body of the first XANA were divided up, analyzed and assimilated into the larger XANA awaiting it. It was like a stream that after having finally crossed the mountains met up with the plains where it could merge with the main river. But it was also something different, something more, like a large explosion. XANA felt the power surging through him, making him tremble with excitement. He was alive. He was a mathematical machine, and the principles of mathematics confirmed that the whole was equal to the sum of its parts. But upon reunifying himself, he became something greater than his individual pieces. He was now a person. And this person needed to find his outlet through something physical, through a body. XANA laughed, and his laughter shook the eternally still trees of Lyoko and ruffled the hair of the children who were watching him from the center of the clearing. He was about to reunite with them, become one of them. He knew that by accepting his new human dimension, he would lose a lot of his powers. He could no longer abandon his body, for example, to enter another's and control them. But that didn't matter to him. To be a person was what was really important to him. To become human. This was his choice, his destiny, and he was ready to accept it with all of its consequences. XANA gave his body form. He let Lyoko construct the identity of its guardian for the last time. He transformed himself into a tall, thin, young boy, dressed in a tight-fitting outfit. His hair was completely disheveled, except that it was no longer black, but the color of wheat left to ripen in the sun. Aelita approached him and extended a hand towards him. "Is it you?" she asked him. "You're XANA?" The young boy nodded his head and gave a slight bow. "I did what I had to do. Thanks to you, Aelita, I'm now a new person. The guardian of Lyoko is from now on a child, just like you." Chapter 11, The Code's Enigma. The children were in the forest sector of Lyoko. They had talked for hours, bringing each other up to date with the latest events, preparing and rejecting new plans to get the Green Phoenix out of the factory once and for all. Aelita contemplated her friends with a smile on her lips. Yumi and Ulrich were finally reunited, and they were now sitting side by side, shoulder to shoulder, their hands brushing now and then. Odd and Eva had also found each other again. They had really only just met each other, as the Eva the boy knew previously had been under XANA's control. But they had immediately began to talk to each other, first in some amusing macaronic English invented by Odd, and then in French. They were now both laughing softly, and Odd was employing his usual repertoire of jokes and quips for seducing girls. All they were missing was Jeremy. Aelita sighed. She would have liked for him to be there with them. How was he doing? What was happening in reality now that Professor Hertz and the others had been captured by the terrorists? XANA, who was serenely contemplating the Lyoko sky, turned towards her. "Do you want to speak to Jeremy?" he asked. Aelita stared at him, surprised. "You can read minds now?" The blonde-haired boy laughed. "Of course not. I can just sense Jeremy's presence. He's working on a computer connected to the factory command post. He's alone at the moment, so if you want, I can establish a safe connection." Aelita enthusiastically accepted and leapt up. "Guys, listen," she exclaimed. "XANA is about to get us into contact with Jeremy." Ulrich nodded in approval and Odd clapped. "Great. We're going to need our know-it-all friend to get out of this mess." XANA raised his hands up and drew a square. From his fingertips, a screen began to take shape, darkening and after several instants showing Jeremy's face. Aelita observed him with concern. The boy was paler than usual and seemed exhausted. He had enormous dark rings under his eyes. "Hi," Jeremy murmured. "How are you going?" Odd leapt to his feet and took the opportunity to put on a show as he updated his friend on the latest news. They had escaped the hermitage through the mirror and finally all reunited on Lyoko. XANA was now on their side, and the children were now waiting for the right time to strike. Jeremy listened to the monologue in silence, occasionally stealing a furtive glance or two at Aelita. The situation, he began to explain when Odd finished his performance, is more complicated than we first thought. Mago has threatened to plunge the whole of France into chaos, and the men in black are getting ready to attack the factory. I think that if they don't manage to stop the Green Phoenix, they're going to reduce it to ashes. Aelita covered her mouth with her hands. "But that's not possible," she then exclaimed. "That would kill us all." XANA shook his head before speaking. "But without me, Mago can't use Lyoko. And I haven't the slightest intention of helping him." "But he can force you to," Jeremy observed. "If you don't do as he says, he'll shut down the supercomputer. What's more, our parents are now his prisoners. He can force us to do whatever he wants." "What are you thinking?" asked Aelita. Jeremy smiled before responding to her. "First of all, I'm going to need help from you and XANA. We need to use the code down and the codes contained in Richard's Palm computer." Memory trembled as she entered the nomadic tent. She sometimes got the feeling that the boss of the Green Phoenix was capable of reading her deepest thoughts. What Jeremy had told her had made her realize why she was his prisoner for 20 years, and so it was really very logical that he had gotten to know her so well. This is why the next task would be so difficult for Memory to overcome. She had to make herself appear as she always had, the subdued, faithful and obedient assistant. She couldn't allow the slightest hint to betray her. "Welcome," said Mago as he gestured, inviting her to sit on the cushions. Near him sat Grigory Nyctopoulos. For once, the man wasn't accompanied by his two dogs. "Can I help you, sir?" Memory asked, keeping her head low and sitting primly, as she usually did. "Perhaps," he responded. "Some people tried to infiltrate the hermitage tonight. We captured almost all of them. But the brats managed to escape at the last moment, using the hermitage scanner to enter Lyoko. Yes, sir. The problem, Mago explained, is that there's nobody on Lyoko. I used the command post personally and I activated all the search programs to localize them. But to no avail. They've escaped. Mago paused and smiled, and his wolf-like eyes looked memory from head to toe from beneath the brim of his hat before changing the subject without warning. I decided to begin to use the supercomputer to deal a decisive blow. But in order to do this, we need to be on Lyoko. I don't trust XANA. He behaves like he should and his robots were of huge help to us, but I fear that he's now thinking of playing a dirty trick on us. And what do I? Memory asked him, not understanding. I want you to prepare a device that can be used to utilize Lyoko's powers without needing to enter the virtual world. The fact that this is a difficult project doesn't interest me, nor do the technical miracles you'll have to invent. I want you to build this machine and I want it now. A soldier had entered the office to bring him something to eat, a slice of moldy bread and a can of disgusting tuna. The man had remained there to observe Jeremy menacingly until he finished eating, before standing behind him to observe the computer monitor. The boy made it look like he was working, blindly opening windows, and showing the soldier screens full of incomprehensible symbols. Finally, by chance, the man decided to leave. Jeremy seized the opportunity to immediately re-establish the connection with Lyoko. His friends had moved to a tower in the forest sector, and were sitting in a circle on the fluorescent platform shaped like the eye of XANA. When he succeeded in establishing contact, XANA was the first to raise his head. There you are. Yes. I ran into a little hitch. Well, how are you getting along? The blonde teen gave a hint of a bent smile. I ran the text of the code down I memorized from Hertz's dossier through a database in the supercomputer. And I transmitted the contents of Richard's palm computer to you, Jeremy replied. We can begin. XANA and Aelita stood and moved to the center of the tower. They then took flight and flew away from the others, touching down on the suspended platform. Jeremy observed the workspace XANA had prepared, flabbergasted. There was a small desk that seemed to be made of the same smooth, resplendent material as the rest of the tower and two chairs that floated in the air without any kind of support. Around them flew several dozen screens full of data that XANA moved from one side to the other with a simple wave of his hand. The three children immediately set to work. Jeremy had often collaborated with Aelita, and they were capable of understanding each other on the fly without needing to say a word, but he now felt a little uncomfortable. Aelita was his best friend, more than that, in fact, but only a few hours ago he had spoken to her mother, and he hadn't yet said anything about it to the girl. Jeremy had good reason not to do it. Memory worked for Hannibal Mago, and he hadn't yet decided if he could put his complete trust in the woman. He didn't want to upset Aelita nor give her false hope of having found the mother she had so long been searching for. And, what's more, there was another thought Jeremy couldn't avoid. It was possible that the factory could be attacked, or that the terrorists could make the first move. Someone could be hurt. And if something happened to Memory? At that moment, XANA's face lit up in an ample smile. Jeremy marveled at the changes he had witnessed in the artificial intelligence. He had told them that he had renounced some of his Lyoko powers, but he had gained many more in exchange. He was less obtuse, and even proved to have great intuition. He knew how to laugh and felt good being around the others. In a way, he acted like a slightly older child ready to help them with anything. I think I understand, he exclaimed. What is it? Aelita immediately asked. The code down. As Professor Hertz told us, it's a program capable of destroying Lyoko. It can erase absolutely every line of programming code and permanently eliminate all of Lyoko's sectors and the first city. It can even kill me. How does it work? Asked Jeremy. Hopper included a sort of security lock. Once the program is charged in the system, Aelita just needs to go to one of the towers and activate the software by typing code down on a screen. And that's it. Jeremy reopened one of the data-filled screens that he had already seen before and began to reinterpret them based on XANA's suggestions. It was true. He began to see some sense in this mysterious program. Aelita was its cornerstone, the person who could demolish Lyoko and permanently reduce it to ashes with a single action. In reality, the subject was much more radical than XANA had suggested. The code down acted on the actual logical components of the supercomputer, altering the circuits and cancelling them out one by one. By using it, the entire factory would become a simple building that had withstood the passage of time for far too long. After having activated the code down, the supercomputer would be nothing more than a very expensive heap of scrap. Aelita got to her feet, looked at Jeremy, and then approached XANA. "If this is all true," she exclaimed, "I promise you that I'll never activate the code down. You have my word." Jeremy gave a small, sad smile. He hoped with all his heart that Aelita could really keep this promise. At that moment the office door opened and the boy needed to press the escape key several times to interrupt the connection with Lyoko and close a few windows of code. He lifted his head and found himself looking at Grigory Nictopoulos' dark face. "Come with me," said the man sharply. Richard Dupuis was bound and gagged. He found himself locked in a small, windowless room, splayed on the floor and hurting from head to toe. In the room with him was only one other person, one of the men in black, but his face was covered by a hood and Richard couldn't see if he was lone wolf, ferret or weasel. Richard was hungry and thirsty. His wetsuit had completely dried and each movement scratched his skin, making him moan in pain. But his main problem was something else: he needed to go to the bathroom. He was perfectly aware that this was a ridiculous need, but he couldn't help it. The young man arched his sore back backwards and yelped in pure pain. Something had stuck into him, breaking through the soft fabric of his neoprene wetsuit. He began to slither across the floor like a snake. His hands and feet were tied together with small, plastic ties that hurt his wrists and ankles. Slowly, he managed to turn to see what had stuck into him. It was nothing more than a twisted nail that had come out of an old, dust-colored wall panel. A nail. A sharp nail. Richard smiled. He turned back to the other side, pushing his back against the wall. He managed to get the rusted point between his hands in such a way that he could apply pressure on it against his plastic handcuffs. He began to rub. Grigory Nictopoulos led Jeremy to the third underground floor, where the supercomputer's operating core was found. Of all the places in the factory, the third floor was the one that had always fascinated Jeremy. The supercomputer was Hopper's grandest invention, the one the professor had dedicated the largest part of his life to. And it was where the heart of the machine was located. The place had now undergone some large changes. Some of the metal planks that made up the flooring had been taken away, and from the gaps sprouted large, colorful cables that connected to several personal computers placed on the floor. Memory was working, crouched down, placing clips on the supercomputer's connectors, studying operational schemas and taking notes. When Grigory arrived, the woman lifted her head. "Thank you," she said mechanically. "You can leave us alone now." "Actually," responded the man with an evil smile, "Mago asked me to not let you out of my sight. Just act like I'm not here. I'll sit here and not bother you at all." Jeremy bit his lip. He had hoped that he would be able to talk to Memory, but Grigory's presence complicated things. The woman explained the situation to him. They needed to find a way to control Lyoko without entering it. "The only way to do something like that," she said with a sigh, "is create a bot controlled by the computer." Jeremy nodded. He had immediately thought of the same thing. A bot was basically a sort of virtual person, like XANA himself, that they'd be capable of controlling at will with a simple joystick. But there was a problem. To be able to do something like that, the boy observed, we'll need detailed plans of the supercomputer. "Yes," Memory responded. "That's why Mago ordered for all this equipment to be prepared. They're currently extracting the schemas of the circuits." Jeremy sat beside the woman, trying to ignore Grigory's being there, watching them menacingly. "Would you happen to have a virtual reality helmet?" he asked. Memory smiled and gave him a pair of dark glasses with lenses large enough to cover half of Jeremy's face. They had a pair of earpieces attached to the arms. "Here," said the woman. "They work using Bluetooth, so all you have to do is put them on, put in the earpieces, and press the button." Jeremy began to hatch a plan. He could use the glasses to connect to the mirror. Once there, he could look for new leads for solving the enigma of Richard's codes.
Finally, XANA become one, and the team is reunited, all but one. Although my vision of complete XANA became something completely different than what I originally thought. What, is he like Super Saiyan now or what? Although, I really do hope that this is not going to have an ending where XANA sacrifices himself and he dies in the end. Because I really hope XANA gets to live amongst the humans in the future. Anyway, more full force into this series, and we are just about halfway through the last book. I really sure do hope it has a good ending. That, and I'll have to go back and remake the episodes prior to book 3, filled me with complete dread. But wish me luck either way, and I'll see you all in the next one. See ya.